Welcome to our post 9/11 strategic land power appraisal. I'm Dr. John Bonin, one of the sponsors for this activity, and so if anybody has any questions during the day, please contact me or Major Jason Warren in the back. It is now my privilege to introduce Major General William Rapp, the 50th Commandant of the United States Army War College, and our host for this event, who will provide opening remarks and introduce our keynote speaker. Sir.
John, thank you very much, and my great appreciation to everyone who's here for this very important conference. This is an important dialogue to be having, and we intend to formalize your thoughts in a compilation in the vein that Colonel Harry Summers did in On Strategy, a critical analysis of the Vietnam War, when he published that in 1982. In 1976, Michael Howard and Peter Perret translated Karl von Clausewitz into a seminal work in English we know simply as On War, greatly influenced Harry Summers in the writing of On Strategy. While likely the most quoted and the least read book in history, On War was the inspiration for Summers' books. And while Summers took on the political leadership in Washington, especially the lack of a declaration of war that would have mobilized or psychologically mobilized the nation, Summers also acknowledged that military leaders failed in their first duty. He wrote, and I quote, "As military professionals, it was our job to judge the true nature of the Vietnam War, communicate those facts to civilian decision makers, and to recommend appropriate strategies." Summers weaved two broad themes throughout his book. The first was that the United States never articulated a concept for victory, but instead built a strategy that centered on avoiding defeat. Second, instead of making victory over North Vietnam, which he described as the source of the war, as our primary task, we allowed ourselves to be diverted into what should have been a secondary task, and that was the defeat of the insurgency in the South. Thus, the tactical sacrifice on the ground in Vietnam failed to achieve the desired strategic effects. Hugh Strachan, in his most recent book, The Declaration of War, or The Direction of War, takes umbrage with this translation of Clausewitz, on the key point being the continuation of policy as Howard and Perret translated the German word Politik. Vice what Strachan believes to be more broadly politics. And in the former, war is subordinate to policy, a tool in the kit bag of strategic political leaders. In the latter, war has its own nature and logic, a battle of wills between adversaries. Strachan writes that war might have started off as a policy choice, but once war is broken out, two sides clash, their policies conflict, and that reciprocity generates its own dynamic, feeding on hatred, on chance, and on the play of military probabilities. Strachan writes that war has its own nature and can have its own consequences, very different from the policies that are meant to be guiding it. So the task for you in this conference, hopefully, is to discuss the use of American land power since the attacks of September 2001 and offer your observations on this critical debate. How can land power have a strategic role for the United States? Our tactical mastery in Iraq and Afghanistan is unquestioned. In 14 years of war, the United States never once had a platoon, Marine or Army, overrun in combat. But how does the United States utilize such land power for strategic effect in coming years? It's a vitally important question, and we have the genuine pleasure of kicking off this conference with Lieutenant General retired Dan Bolger, a soldier and a scholar who knows well both war and war fighting. Dan Bolger served for 35 years in the United States Army, retiring as Lieutenant General in 2013 after commanding Coalition Military Assistance Training Team in Iraq 2005 to 2009, the 1st Cavalry Division in Baghdad 2009, 2010, and the NATO Training Mission Afghanistan 2011 through 13. He earned his master's and doctorate in history from the University of Chicago and has taught history at the United States Military Academy at West Point. General Bolger has authored 8 books and numerous articles on military and historical matters, and his latest book, Why We Lost, A General's Inside Account of Iraq and Afghanistan Wars, has just been published. He is presently the assistant professor in the Department of History and a distinguishing visiting scholar in the School of Public and International Affairs at North Carolina State University. Please join me in welcoming Lieutenant General Dan Bolger.
Thank you very much, Bill. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention and your interest in this really important subject. I can't think of anything more vital to be discussing right here in the Army War College than the nature of war since 9/11 and what we've learned and what we need to learn. Well, I'm a United States Army general, and I lost the global war on terrorism. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous. Step one, you have to admit you have a problem. Well, I have a problem. So do my peers. Thanks to our problem, now all of America has got one too. 2 lost campaigns and a war we are not winning. I've had people challenge me on that statement. Some say we didn't lose. Tell that to ISIS and the Taliban. You won't have any trouble finding them. They sure outnumber us on the ground over there these days. Others say we didn't lose yet. Ask the Haider al-Abadi government in Baghdad, though you'd have to go through all their Iranian advisors to find them. Or check with Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai and his government in Kabul. They're easy to find in the capital because the West, the Southwest, the East, and now the Northeast, goodbye Kunduz, are all Taliban country. It all smells like Saigon around November of 1974, enjoying the last months of what the great foreign policy guru Henry Kissinger once labeled a decent interval. You know what comes next, and it won't be decent. So yes, our enemies are on the march, and yes, our local friends are feeble and doomed. That smells like losing to me. But the really sophisticated observers tell me I've got it all wrong. You see, in modern warfare, such as it is, old-fashioned ideas like winning and losing no longer apply. You must instead weigh the nuanced development of longer-term trends in the prevailing narrative of international relations at the governmental and non-governmental levels. Win and lose are such limited terms. We have to get beyond all that. Yeah, whatever. As we used to say, and probably still should, tell it to the Marines. For me, I'm going to stick with what I know as a soldier of 35 years. Wars are won or wars are lost. And we have lost this one. We need to quit bullshitting ourselves. In the United States Army, when we run a training exercise or a combat operation, we try to end it with an after-action review. While we have long done versions of this, if you've seen movies like Patton or Saving Private Ryan or We Were Soldiers, you know that. We institutionalized the AAR concept in a big way after Vietnam. Although we didn't give him credit, any self-respecting guerrilla chieftain would recognize it as a good old Mao Zedong self-criticism session, minus all that stuff about capitalist roaders and the running dogs of Wall Street. In an after-action review, you have to figure out what happened, you have to figure out why it happened, and how to fix it. You don't bog down in finding blame, although leaders are expected to stand up and admit mistakes. Don't be thin-skinned. Focus on lessons. Focus on fixes. Focus on the future. So what lessons can we find in this lost war? At the level of strategy, the big picture, why we fight, the goal, a few things are clear. First, in the words of former Army Chief of Staff and longtime Special Operations Commander General Pete Schoomaker, don't get treed by chihuahuas. Go after the big dog and only the big dog. The 9/11 attacks were done by Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. Their entire full-time leadership would fit in this room with some seats to spare. That was the target. A bad one, but not a big one. It was a target for intelligence, it was a target for law enforcement, and for selected military forces, air power and special operators mostly. So why in the hell did we get bogged down in a decade-plus slog between Tajiks and Pashtuns in Afghanistan and a three-way scrum between Sunni Arabs, Shiite Arabs, and Kurds in Iraq? The Chihuahuas not only treat us, they peed on us, they need us, and now they exceed us. While hundreds and thousands of our best men and women poke through trash heaps looking for hand grenades, our big-time adversaries in Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing laughed all the way to their next land grabs in Syria, the Crimea, and the South China Sea. Another strategic lesson is that we don't organize well for today's war. One of the reasons we did go after the Taliban in 2001 and Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist Iraqis in 2003 is because we didn't have the right arrangements to hunt down and finish off Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda. We could run them around, we could kill some of them, and we could keep them hopping. Eventually, we learned how to hunt the ringleaders, but we didn't really uproot the movement. We got better, but never good enough to win. Getting good enough to win would take a full court press of diplomacy, information, military means, and economic strength, what we call all instruments of national power, and that band hasn't had a hit in years. Diplomacy means both regional and worldwide efforts. It requires lining up coalitions and keeping them together for the long haul. It also means listening to our allies. Sometimes they're full of it, but sometimes they know better, a lot better. Information, for that you could read propaganda, or as we like to call it in America, advertising. You know, we live in a country where they can convince you that a Ford truck is better than a Chevy and Coke is different than Pepsi. Well, maybe. You'd think we could sell our country's ideas half as well. Military power includes more than just 100,000 boots on the ground, which seem to be our standard solution in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Buy new surge, gets the jihadi out. No, it takes a much more clever use of military means. You need frontline advisors, you need special operations forces, intelligence, air power, and a willingness to find and trust local allies. Finally, it takes economic and social power, which is America's most effective means. This is not just classic foreign aid or care packages. It's a willingness to open societies to ours. You know, cell phone service and literacy education provided far more effective civic action in Sunni Arab villages and Pashtun hamlets than any big road projects or attempts to create massive power grids. Diplomacy, information, military means, economic power, we call that the whole of government, and we're just not there yet. Our current methods are perfect for the Cold War with the Soviet Russians. They smack at the 1947 National Security Act as modified by the 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act, which only addressed the military. And so we have a very large and capable military, but that's only part of the team. Our foreign service officers are able and they are wise, but way too few. You know, there's more Marines in a reinforced line regiment at Camp Lejeune than foreign service officers in our entire Department of State. You can only spread a few thousand diplomats so far, and at a certain point, numbers do matter. As for information, we hog-tie ourselves with legalisms and other kinds of nitwittery. Our enemies put an attack video on YouTube seconds after it happens. For them, the attack is secondary. The YouTube video is the point of the whole thing. We insist that every picayune talking point be vetted up through cabinet and sometimes even White House level. As a result, we are days late, which is to say, useless. As Lieutenant General J.R. Vines, who commanded 18th Airborne Corps in Iraq in 2005, used to put it, quote, "I can drop a bomb now and kill any bad guy in Iraq, but to drop a leaflet, I need 10 high-level signatures," unquote. We are way too slow. Our all-volunteer military is built for rapid, decisive, conventional operations against uniformed enemies. We're the exact right guys for a takedown, but we're the SWAT team. We're not the neighborhood cops. We do Desert Storm, not Vietnam. If you need a nation built or an insurgency battled for 2 decades, well, that's not our style. But it is very much our enemy's style. The insurgents live there, they're not going anywhere, and when hundreds of thousands of us stay, we feed the enemy narrative. Imperialists, occupiers, infidels, you know the drill. So what do? I think we have to be ready to commit small numbers of troops, maybe a few thousand backed by air power, intelligence, and logistics, to very long-term efforts. The locals must take the lead, and we must support. But we must sign on for the long haul. And we tell the American people publicly it's a long haul. And we ask for their okay in accord with our Constitution. That means laws and treaties debated and passed through Congress, not side deals made out on the diplomatic equivalent of a cocktail napkin. The current phase in both Iraq and Afghanistan might be about right in terms of numbers. But we need to look at a long-term commitment. Quit screwing around and sticking fingers in the wind for the next poll. Either stay or go. And if we stay, the task must be straightforward. You can't be an effective combat advisor from inside a barbed wire compound. It's okay to have only a few American combat advisors, but if I learned anything doing this in both countries, I learned that advisors must be willing to fight, and if need be, die alongside their counterparts. The locals, they're the key. That's a strategic lesson, all right. I can remember a General Officers Conference in Baghdad back in 2006. Back then I was a one-star and I was a backbencher running the Iraqi military advisory element. After reviewing about 1 million slides full of numbers and color codes and bullet points and hearing how the trends were positive and the outlooks were improving and all that other stuff that reminded you of some briefing in Da Nang around 1967, the big guy, General George Casey, leaned back in his chair and he flipped up his glasses. That always meant he was frustrated. And he said, "What the hell is the problem here?" Silence. No response. The two-star general making the pitch just stood there. Casey repeated, "What's the problem?" Us. I stood up and said that. General Casey stared at me, and like any good top commander, he had one of those stares that could burn holes in plate armor. But he didn't disagree. The word just hung there. Us. Then the briefing went on, and the war went on. And to the end, we remained the problem. By definition, 100,000 gringos running around your country means the local government is a puppet. And to the populations in Iraq and Afghanistan, the guys we installed and propped up sure as hell looked like American stooges. Look at Hamid Karzai, the president of Afghanistan for almost the entire war from 2001 to 2014. Educated in Afghanistan and India, where he learned his impeccable English, Karzai worked for the Central Intelligence Agency during the 1979 to 89 war with the Soviet Union. Karzai liked to think of himself as the conscience of the Pashtun nation, which would have been news to them, who saw him as a U.S. toady. We took good care of him for years. Karzai complained constantly about night raids on Afghan villages and messy airstrikes on Taliban fighters. We responded with public and abject apologies and millions of dollars in aid. Karzai pocketed both and then upped the ante on the next round. His corruption set records. Oh, and while he was at it, Karzai stole the 2009 election while we looked the other way. Pashtun villagers summarized things this way: the government robs us, the Taliban beat us, and NATO bombs us. That's not exactly a recipe for success. How about this guy Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister of Iraq during the height of the war from 2006 to 14? A legend in his own mind. Maliki's name means king in Arabic. His resume screams pawn. Having spent years in Iran and Syria, he was a classic Shia partisan, ill-educated, introverted, suspicious of everyone. He became prime minister by default in the dark days of 2006. He was the second-tier compromise choice of various Shiite factions, and he was acceptable to the Americans. After taking charge, Maliki ruled in the heavy-handed style seen before in the likes of American clients Ngo Dinh Diem, South Vietnam, Pak Chung-hee, South Korea, Nguyen Van Tu of South Vietnam, Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, Shahreza Pahlavi of Iran, Anastasio Somoza, Nicaragua. Maliki fit right in with that unsavory bunch. The Iraqi prime minister personally directed off-the-books secret snatch teams and demonstrated a propensity to arrest and try his political opponents. He stole the Iraqi election in 2010, and we looked the other way. Well, as the Americans like to say, he might be a son of a bitch, but at least he was our son of a bitch. Unfortunately, he was also Iran's son of a bitch, and he was mostly his own son of a bitch. We have to get off this treadmill. Before we go into a country, we need to figure out which groups and leaders we can support and which ones we can't. If we're not sure, we need to limit ourselves to punitive strikes and get the hell out. The British regiments on the old northwest frontier of India used to call that butcher and bolt. It isn't pretty, but it sure beats squat and lose. What about tactical lessons, the fighting stuff? You heard General Raff refer to this earlier. Well, here the results are much better. Our troops fought superbly, and we clearly outfought our foes time after time. But the Germans could claim as much in both world wars, and so could the Confederates in our Civil War. Tactical excellence only goes so far. As a U.S. colonel once told a North Vietnamese colonel after the war, "You know, you never defeated us on the battlefield." "That may be so," said the North Vietnamese officer, "but it is also irrelevant." The North Vietnamese guy was right. An unbeaten string in firefights is great, but what matters is how your tactics contribute to winning the war. We fought well, but generals, guys like me, didn't ask our great men and women to do things worth doing. We wasted their skill and bravery poking through trash heaps in 1,000 villages. We also imposed some stupid stuff on our people. Look, the next time some genius on CNN starts babbling on about a surgical strike, turn off the television. The guy doesn't understand war. There's nothing surgical about modern warfare. I know on NCIS when Leroy Jethro Gibbs shoots somebody, only the bad guy gets hit. Same when you play Call of Duty or Halo. But in real life, when you shoot a 5.56 millimeter bullet from an M4 carbine, it doesn't just stop when it hits the target. The bullet zips out at 2.5 times the speed of sound and will kill out to 550 yards, 5.5 football fields. But the bullet can keep going out to 3,937 yards, which is more than 2 miles. Even out at that range, it does damage. A 5.56 slug goes in small, a pencil hole. But its velocity is so high that when it hits something, it tumbles. So it comes out big. You see a dot on the front and the back end blown away. That's a modern rifle bullet, and we seldom shoot just one. What about a 120 millimeter tank main gun round? A Hellfire missile, a 1,000-pound bomb, a Tomahawk cruise missile. Even if you hit right on target, you make a horrible mess. War is violent. It is brutal. People get killed. And an insurgent enemy, a terrorist enemy, wears civilian clothes and hides in the civilian population. These guys set up in mosques, in schools, in hospitals, in orphanages. That is not a bug for them. It's a feature. I have seen generals try to micromanage these tactics. They diddled with every raid sequence, and they played around with the foot patrol schemes, and they required high-level approval for the use of artillery and attack helicopters and airstrikes. You know, that's easy to say when you're sitting on your butt in a well-lit command post. But out on the ground, it's dead wrong. We talk about how great our men and women are, and they are great. Why don't we trust them to sort it out? When we start to act and then back off, when we hem and haw, when we wring our hands, the enemy thinks we're stupid. Worse, they think we're weak. So do the local villagers. And we lose good men and women for nothing. Then we lose the war anyway. When it comes to using force, as they say in the airborne, there's only one way, all the way. You do no favors pulling punches. As General William Tecumseh Sherman put it, war is cruelty and you cannot refine it. War is hell. Go in hard, go in fast, finish it. Sherman also had something important to say about leadership in combat. Too many generals of his era were not willing to press the fight. By the Civil War, the telegraph had allowed generals to step back from the battlefield. Safe in the rear area, they thought they could direct intricate maneuvers with cool heads, unhindered by blood, death, and friction. Sherman, who led his soldiers under fire many times, thought otherwise, and I quote, "Some men think that modern armies may be so regulated that a general can sit in an office and play on his several columns as on the keys of a piano. This is a fearful mistake. The directing mind must be at the very head of the army, must be seen there, and the effect of his mind and personal energy must be felt by every officer and man present with it to secure the best results. Every attempt to make war easy and safe will result in humiliation and disaster," unquote. Amen. Sherman knew the deal. I'm convinced that the same information technologies that make our weapons so accurate have created a pathology far worse than anything in Sherman's time. We have commanders as low as company, battery, and troop level, 100 soldiers, who think their place in war is a climate-controlled command post staring at a video screen. In this war, very few generals ever walked a patrol, raided a target, or recovered the wounded. And as a result, our generals didn't understand the war. And while too many of us entertained ourselves with PowerPoint slides, the enemy just kept shooting back. The numbers never added up, and after enough years and enough pointless firefights, we gave up. So this war has given us some very hard lessons. But as the great Command Sergeant Major Mark S. Ripka taught me years ago, compiling lessons is one thing, learning them is another. We had the physical courage to fight day after day, month after month, year after year on the far side of the world. Will we have the moral courage to learn and apply these hard lessons? For me, the hardest lesson of all is the one I didn't learn until much too late. In 3 deployments, 2 to Iraq, 1 to Afghanistan, totaling 4 years in theater, I lost 76 men, 4 women. I sensed we were flailing, and then I sensed we were failing. But I didn't speak up, at least not enough to make a difference. I didn't ask the hard questions. And so we failed. I personally failed my fellow soldiers, and it failed you, my fellow citizens. Well, that's a pretty damn discouraging account, but it's what I think. You may not agree, plenty of people don't, and I've heard from a lot of them, but I think that's as it should be. This has been a hard war, and we must talk about it. We must figure out what happened, we must figure out why it happened, and we have to figure out what to do about it. We don't have the luxury of spin and happy talk and avoidance and denial. Our enemies are still out there. Are they ever? So when you think about what the hell we just did to ourselves and to our enemies in Iraq and Afghanistan, I urge you to ask the hard questions. I'm not sure I can answer them. And I'm not sure I can ever answer the families of our honored dead. But I can try. We can all try. We can do that. Thank you. I sure will, Dr. John. Yes, absolutely.
Jason, you want to get that microphone right there? Please, anybody, question?
Stunned silence. That's always a bad sign.
Morning, sir. Bert Tussing, Center for Strategic Leadership. Thanks very much for your presentation and the sobriety. I was going to try and sit quietly because most of the people in this room are focused on conventional war. I'm worried about the war coming home. I'm worried about the things that you saw played out over there, playing out over here. And I'm worried about the Army's reticence in wanting to engage in plans to do something about it before it occurs. I was wondering if you've given that any thought and what we should be doing that we are obviously not doing right now.
In terms of Homeland Security?
Yes, sir. Homeland Defense, if you will.
From what I saw, I mean, the military is obviously very reluctant to engage in anything at home other than, support the civil authorities. I mean, most of us are familiar with things like going in after Hurricane Katrina and all that kind of stuff, but obviously we have a long tradition in the United States of not wanting to use our military interacting with the civilian populace except in, disaster relief type environment. So I'll tell you the truth, I have to be honest, I didn't think much about it, and I was glad we didn't get a task to do that. I think in the case of our enemies, that's obviously a fault line they would probably want to exploit if they could, cause a big enough problem that we'd have to employ our military, in the States. But as well-trained as our National Guard is, and they, dual mission and all that, I think they also would prefer to stick to the disaster relief. They don't want to get into providing local security. I mean, right after 9/11, we had some of that, but nothing ever came to fruition with it. But I mean, it's clearly, if you're a bad guy, that's what you want to cause. You want to cause a big enough problem that you create a political crisis where you have to commit American forces in the American streets. You want the United States to look like Northern Ireland during the Troubles, or the occupied territories with Israel, or something. You want that type of an environment if you could cause that. And I sure hope we don't get to that. Your warning is we got an enemy who certainly wants to create it. Yes, sir. Yes, Brigadier General Lance Petros, yes. Well, I think the first step, Lance, and a great question, the first step, at least from my point of view, is you got to admit that you lost. I mean, it goes back to how you do an after-action review. The first part, the old after-action review that most of us were taught, is you got to look at the results of the conflict. You know, in the case of the old thing at a fight National Training Center, you'd sort of look at, you know, what happened in the battle. Did you accomplish your mission or not? What were the casualties? In this war, that's the first step. You first have to say, what's the outcome of the war? One of the things that I found disturbing when I was on active duty, and I don't think it's changed all that much, and there's a lot of good reasons within the traditions of the military why we don't do it, is that the General Officer Corps, as a rule, doesn't want to talk about the war. I mean, I was pretty sure we were losing when we quit talking about the war. You know, when all we talk about now is the bravery and great service of our young men and women, which is well worth talking about, but we no longer talk about outcomes. That told me we'd lost. I think it's important as a means of accountability that senior leaders need to say, hey, I screwed this up, this went wrong. But, you know, the record is pretty clear. You go back to Vietnam, it took many years for senior leaders to admit that that war had failed. I mean, some started to by the mid-'70s. You can read General Westmoreland's memoirs, and he pointedly says in the last chapter where he's reflecting on the war, I just want to point out, we didn't lose the war. We were winning when I left. You know, the South Vietnamese law. Okay, fine, whatever. It was the younger guys, it was the Major Powells and the Major Schwarzkopfs and the others of that era who stepped forward and said, hey, this war was lost, and we need to do something about fixing it. I'll tell you right now, no matter what generals, former generals, colonels, whatever think, the younger people know the deal. All right, the soldiers, the young people we work with, they have no illusions about what happened. And they also have no illusions about where to point the finger. Remember what the extract that General Rapp read from Colonel Summers' book. You know, the younger people in the service see that their military leaders did not complete the tasks they were given. Guys like myself didn't give adequate advice to the civilian leaders. We couldn't lay out a war-winning strategy. And we didn't have enough moral courage to say, hey, maybe this thing's unwinnable, and we need to just say stop and pull out. We instead split the difference and got a compromise that ended up in a defeat. So it is personal, and for me, and I think other generals and other senior leaders are going to have to make their own determination on what went on. But the facts on the ground day after day are indicating, you know, this thing sure went the wrong way. Yes, sir.
I remember we sat there at West Point as history instructors, you and I and Lance, and we listened to Harry Summers say the same thing. And then we came back and said, well, the fix for this is just simply to get better guidance, better direction, and less restrictions. Given today's political climate and some of the reputations and things we have to manage around the world, is that really a viable political option? If the use of force has to support the politics that then in turn we want to advance. The second thing, though, I'd come back to is I remember also the common theme with Summers' book and with the discussion we had 30 years ago is the fact that the politicians did not sufficiently organize themselves in order to change the conflict environment over time. The failure of the pacification program is an example.
Yeah.
And to work effectively with a government that we could work smartly with. How do military professionals try to help fix that process in D.C. after the failure of the whole of government planning efforts in SPD 44, where we tried to get things organized? As a matter of fact, we stood behind it, we planned it, we supported it, we helped in Cadrea, we put funds and publications by GIFCOM behind it, all those type of things. We tried to help that process organize itself, and in effect, it's going back to what it was before.
Yeah.
Part of that is what can we do to help that process?
Well, I think, thanks, Jim. Good questions. Just overall, I think the problems that Colonel Harry Summers identified in on strategy, some of those are built into the American political tradition. By our nature, we have governments that are going to change every so often. Actually, what's interesting to me, having served under both the President Bush 43 administration and the President Obama administration, was the amazing consistency between the two administrations. Despite rhetoric that was different, in many cases they carried out the same tasks. I mean, the withdrawal of most combat forces from Iraq in 2011 that a lot of people blame, depending on your political spectrum, they blame or they praise the current administration for doing, was based on an agreement made in December 2008 by the Bush administration, and it was word for word what they then executed. What I found and what was kind of disturbing to me really is how little our senior leadership engages at the strategic level. There are exceptions. I mean, most of us, Pete Menser can talk in some detail about this. We haven't had the opportunity to work for General Petraeus during the height of the surge. But I think you'd also agree, Pete, and maybe not, but that General Petraeus was exceptional. That most senior leaders, and I know I was one of them, my attitude about dealing with politicians or suits or whatever was, what's the bare minimum I need to tell this guy so he leaves me the hell alone and I can go back to doing military stuff? What we've created in the U.S. military, it was probably accidental, but it was a result of Vietnam. We have focused down. We focused on fighting. We no longer engage at the strategic level. George Marshall could turn to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and say to him in the early days of World War II, we should not engage in North Africa. We shouldn't invade there. We should make a cross-channel operation. The main enemy is Germany. Why are we getting bogged down in peripheral? They could have a dialogue back and forth, and they did. You know, Ernest King, the guy who, Dwight Eisenhower's a planner, once said, the best thing to help the war would be somebody should shoot Admiral King. Well, one of the reasons he wanted to shoot Admiral King is because Admiral King kept bringing up stuff that he thought the president and Marshall and others needed to hear that didn't suit the Army planner's view of the world. Okay, fine. I don't see that kind of rich dialogue. For 16 months, I was the Army G3, which was probably a mistake on the Army's part, putting somebody like me in that job, but they did. And I would tell you that I wasn't good at it, and I didn't do all that well at it. But that said, one of the things that amazed me, as the Army G3, you sit on the operations deputies, so you see every subject that's going to go in front of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You pre-vet it, you go to it, and you go to their meeting as well. In the 16 months I was up there, how many meetings do you think we had? This would have been 2010, 2011. How many meetings did we have on the strategic progress in Iraq and Afghanistan? I'll give you a hint. Zero. Zero. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were arguing about who should supply the next dog team to Guantanamo. They were debating who got the Predator orbits over Iraq. They had delved down to the level of comfort, which is sort of battalion, squadron commander, ship captain. They'd gone to the level they were at. That, to me, is really alarming, and it's really disturbing. But I know because I saw the tendencies in myself. There's a wide enough gap between us and a lot of the civil leaders. What the civil leaders do, it's not that they don't listen to the military, they do. But what they tend to do is they shop. They find the military person that's going to give them what they want to hear. So if you're President Bush and it's the fall of 2006 and your Iraq study group tells you need to withdraw and your Joint Chiefs of Staff all tell you to a man you need to withdraw and your theater commander and your force commander all tell you need to withdraw, well, you shop around until you can find a general who tells you something different. And in his case, it was some retired generals, including General Keane, General McCaffrey, Elliot Cohen, who's not a general but a senior civilian. Those kind of people. You find them and they say, well, maybe what you should do is surge. Oh, well, I like that solution. And then you find some guys who want to do that. In the case of President Obama, he would get certain guidance from the field, from General McChrystal and others, and then he would shop around and he'd look around his staff and he'd find Lieutenant General Doug Lute and other guys who would give him information that was different than that. Look, there's no shortage of generals and admirals that you can get advice from. But I think the reality is the statutory advice that's provided by the chairman in this war has been lacking. It's been poor, and in general, it's been late to need. And in a lot of ways, we're right where we were when H.R. McMaster wrote Dereliction of Duty in Vietnam. It hasn't changed all that much. And boy, the other thing, I was mentioning this to Professor Wick Murray before the thing, but I know it now, having lived it. When I was young, when we were at the Department of History back in the old days, I think Ulysses Grant had just graduated, but when we were back there, we were pretty sure that the real problem was just those scurrilous bums who were the generals up the top. And when we could get the right guys up there, they wouldn't do things for the nefarious reasons the current people had all done it. You know what I found out? What my mom used to tell me was true. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. People attempting to do what they thought was the right thing, making incremental decisions, is what causes these problems. Every single person involved was trying to do the right thing. I met very few people who were nefarious, criminal in any sense, or even that self-serving, a few cases of that. But by and large, even the ones who were self-serving were trying to look to the bigger mission. Yet, when you added up all the decisions and non-decisions, they took us in the wrong direction. Or worse, they prevented us from seeing the direction we were going in, and both are just as dangerous. Yes, sir.
Do you believe that at any point after the initial invasion of Iraq, so starting in early April 2003, could the United States have won that conflict or finished it in an acceptable strategic fashion?
Yes.
What points are those?
I think there were a couple points. Acceptable strategic fashion is a great way to put it. There was the initial option, which would have been to go in, knock out Saddam Hussein, and just turn it over to Chalabi or God help us, whoever, and just say, hey, good luck, you guys, we're all counting on you. You know, go in, basically knock him out and pull out. That would have left a mess, but probably no different than the current mess. I mean, Iraq had a lot of centrifugal things going on between their different ethnic and religious groups that were going to happen with or without us. Another option to do that would have been in 05, 06, basically the Iraq Study Group option, where you say, don't surge, declare failure, begin a slow withdrawal, and leave whatever residual force you can, basically what we got today. And then the other option would have been after the surge to have a much more organized withdrawal and draw down. I mean, speaking as somebody who worked, as Bill mentioned, I worked on both the advisory side in Iraq and Afghanistan. No matter what we said on paper, advising and assisting the Iraqi and Afghan military and police was never our priority. It might have been the priority for a few of the commanders, but when you got out in the field, the bottom line for American units was to go out and fight the enemy. I mean, that's what they were trained to do, and that's what they did do. And so as a result, I see a couple options there. The sad thing, Pete, is I think all of them would have brought us about to where we are now. But to me, we could have skipped all the deaths and destruction and confusion and wishful thinking that's gone between now and then. And the one option we didn't mention that I think we could have chosen in 03 not to go in at all, to just continue Northern and Southern Watch, to let Saddam be the jerk that he was and abuse his people and stuff, and just maybe focus on trying to sort out this mess we'd made in Afghanistan. But we didn't choose that one either.
That's why I forced you to begin in April of 2000.
Yeah, no, I figured that. Yeah. Well, but again, the other thing I find, ladies and gentlemen, you've probably seen this too. In the U.S., this stuff all has domestic political overtones. So if you're on one side of the fence, the problem is the invasion of Iraq. Bush lied, 1,000 died, whatever. That's one group says that. Then the other groups, the ones that support that, turn around and say, yeah, but everything was going good until he pulled, and then he pointed to the current administration, pulled everybody out, quote unquote. And, as you need to be aware, not everybody was pulled out. We had many, many advisors. The current superintendent of West Point can tell you about that because General Kasdan, commanded that force while it was over there, and it included over 4,000 U.S. contractors who were on the ground from 11 till 13. They're still over there, by the way, along with our uniformed advisors. But leaving all that aside, I think, Pete, you've raised it. It became a question of what do you want for an outcome? What's the best outcome you can get? And I think once we knocked out Saddam Hussein, the natural disconnects that are existing in Iraq, Sunni versus Shia, Kurd versus Arab, they were going to pull it apart, without a strong central authority. Yes, sir, in the back in uniform.
Hey, sir. Colonel Mastriano, thank you for your clarity and your honesty in your remarks. Just in our lifetimes, and you noted this, Vietnam, Iraq, it's heartbreaking. It's just watching almost a repeat in history. Some shadows anyway there. Great strategic setbacks for the United States. I just wonder if there's two problems. First off, if we're the modern day version of the Redcoats, we just can't get the job done. Or are there just limits to what we can do as leaders in the United States military? And it's really up to, in the end, civilian leadership and their vision for the future. What would you advise us to do as an instructor at the War College to talk to my students about in this regard?
Well, good questions. I would point out that the British, for all the things they screwed up, they did learn from what happened to them in North America. And they did a much better job in colonial and imperial administration, if you will. I mean, I think most people would agree that nobody wants to be colonized, but if you were colonized after 1783, the British were not the worst guys to come in and do it. Your country may come out of it okay. Yeah. And that was some lessons learned, and they never, there was certainly no formal lessons learned process in London that did it. But they gradually accumulated that, what they'd done in North America with the 13 colonies didn't work, and they needed to come up with a better solution. I think for us, and here at the War College in particular, for people talking to War College students, the biggest thing is that we must engage the civilian leadership, and we must engage the right civilian leadership. There is a tendency, like I said, for military people to avoid dealing with the civilians. They deal with them the minimum amount. Look, a president or a secretary of defense is going to need somebody to talk to, some advice, whatever. And if the military is not the person to provide it, they're going to turn to the 13-year-olds who have degrees from Georgetown that are sitting around their desk, and they're going to give them advice. And those people have played all the issues of Call of Duty, and they have all the maps on their PowerPoint. They're going to come up with some swell ideas, and we've seen the results of that. But to me, when we let that happen, there's only one person we can look at, and that's us. The military has to be willing to man or woman up and knock on the door and go in and talk to that civilian leader and force the issue. And sometimes what we have to say is, this can't be done. What you're asking us to do, Mr. President, Madam Secretary, whatever, this can't be done. This task here is beyond our capability, or we can do it, and here's the risks. I think that the classic example of that, and again, it was a unique time in history because the president at that time was a former 5-star general who had a lot of experience. But the classic example is General Ridgway in the Army Staff's presentation to Eisenhower in the spring of 1954 about assisting the French in Vietnam, where Ridgway comes in and basically says, okay, we can do this, and it's going to take 10 divisions and 1 million guys and 20 years, and I can't guarantee an outcome. Is that what you want? Oh, I don't think so. But the other thing that I've seen in the United States, whatever party they're in, most political leaders do not want to seem to be contrary to the military. Most political leaders want to say, hey, I asked my senior commanders, they said X, and I gave them what they asked for. So in a lot of ways, it's up to the senior commanders behind closed doors to make the case as to what the strategy from a military perspective could be done, what are the real options, and then, decide whether or not you can live with it. And I think, I know in that regard, I didn't get it right at all. I mean, I missed opportunities to engage the civilian leadership, and moreover, I think I spent way too much time doing military stuff, even though I know the strategic was all messed up. Because it was easier to go out and do patrols and look for IEDs and all that, because I knew how to do that. But it wasn't what we needed.
So we have time for one more question. Wick, do you have one?
Yes, I do. General, I've been an observer of the American military since 1964, both as a participant and then a critic and a student of military history. It strikes me that one of the real weaknesses, which to a certain extent you've been referring to, is that the culture is far too bureaucratic, far too unwilling, if you will, to debate seriously, if you will, choices and alternatives. How do you change the culture of military organizations? I think that's really a fundamental question that we confront now. And as General Van Riper, a good friend of mine, said, it's really difficult to change the culture of military organizations. What would you recommend?
I think we have some examples of that. To change the culture of the military, you have to change the leadership. I mean, that's what's going to direct it. We've talked about the great men and women we have who join our forces. They'll do whatever they're asked to do, but we're asking them the wrong things. We have to look very, very carefully at how we educate and select our leaders at all levels, and it starts early. If George Marshall was to resurrect and stand right here, he would recognize our professional military education system because it was the same one he went through in the early 20th century. Is that appropriate given where we're at now? How we choose, I think in the American military we optimize. I'll talk about my service, the Army. The Army optimizes to train and choose battalion and squadron commanders. That's what we train for. We build everything around that. Everything else is treated as an afterthought to include our general officer corps. And so guys like myself or Bill Rapp or Lance Betros or any of us, the only reason we end up as generals is because we were probably pretty good battalion commanders. But the reality is I didn't need to be a good battalion commander when I was in Washington Iraq or Afghanistan. I needed to be a good general, and I hadn't learned that right stuff. So I think we got to take a serious white butcherboard look at our professional military education system and our leader development. Everything we've done until now, and when I was in Army G3, we did multiple studies. I mean, God knows we pissed plenty of money and time away on that kind of stuff. But they always come back and ratify what we have. And I mean, the surest sign that you've got a problem is when they keep changing the names of everything. They haven't changed the name of the Army War College, but I mean, the Infantry Officer Advanced course is now called the Infantry Captain's Career Course, but it's the same damn course, okay? I mean, it's the same thing, you know. The Infantry Officer Basic course that I went to is now Basic Officer Leadership Course. It's the same course, you know. I mean, and it's not just the officers. I think we got to look at the NCOs, the warrant officers. We got to look at how we select and train our leaders and promote our leaders. One thing that I found amazing is that, you know, you talk about strange. The U.S. Army, I think today we got 11 in the active roles, but when I was around, they had 10 divisions. You might think that if the Army was going to pick a division commander, they might go in and like interview the dude. No, you just, you know, the mystical Ouija board, boom, off a paper record. You know, okay, well, you're going to get the results that you expect out of that. Our bureaucratic system, WIC, is still built as if we had an 8 million person Army and we were fighting World War II. We don't. We have a much smaller force. We know each other, and we got to get a lot more serious about how we select and educate our leaders. And I know this conference is a good example of the kind of direction we need to go in.
Sir, thank you very much for your remarks.